All right, we're in Revelation 18. Go back to Revelation 17 real quickly. And the name of the sermon is The Identity of Babylon. The Identity of Babylon. And so a couple weeks ago, we talked about the concept of Babylon, just some general thoughts and ideas of, what this end times Babylon is about and how it's been, throughout history. And then last week we showed the history of Babylon, how there's been different empires that have ruled and reigned both before Babylon and afterwards. And today what we're talking about is the identity of Babylon. And when we say the identity of Babylon, realize that the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar's day is no longer. Okay, so this end times Babylon is a different Babylon. What is the identity of Babylon in Revelation 18? Okay, well, in Revelation 17, I want you to notice something. In verse 9, it says, "And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is." Now, last week we talked about that. 5 are fallen: Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, the Medes and Persians, Greece. And then it says, and 1 is. So what was the country in power in John's day? Obviously Rome, okay? And the Roman Empire lasted for a long time. So that's what we talked about last week. But then it says this, and the other is not yet come. Okay, so it's going to speak about a 7th one that is not yet come. And so earlier in the chapter, what he's describing is the one that is, okay? And he's going to transition to this end times empire. The other is not yet come, and when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition, okay? So what is this 7th empire? Well, I believe this 7th empire, I think it's referring to the United States of America. Okay, and I'm going to give you a lot of reasons here tonight, but realize this: when it comes to prophecy, we know in part, we prophesy in part, and look, this is not 2 + 2 = 4. We're looking towards the future and making predictions based on verses, and you know what? To be honest, some verses in prophecy you might misinterpret when you're looking forward into the future. Now, last week's sermon was directly what the Bible said, because we're looking in the past and these things have been declared, okay? Prophecy took place and then we saw those events take place in history. That's what the Bible says. But as we're looking towards the future, this is not like 2 + 3 = 5, okay? It's not 2 + 2 = 4. It's not 2 + 3 = 5, okay? I'm not saying, dogmatically 100% without a shadow of a doubt that this is the United States of America. I will say this, though. If it were to take place, today or in 5 years or in 10 years or in 20 years or in 25 years, there's no question it must be the U.S., and we will see that here tonight. Now, there are some other theories out there. Some people think it's Mecca. That's one of the big theories. People think it's Mecca and it's all about, Islam and everything. Another big theory is Rome. Now, I understand why people think it's Rome, because Revelation 17 is about Rome, but there's a transition to the next empire, okay? So I understand why they would think it's Rome, but some people think Revelation 18, the end times Babylon, is the Roman Catholic Church. That sounded good hundreds of years ago, but the Roman Catholic Church has fallen since that time, and the Bible speaks about a 7th one. Some people believe it's Jerusalem. Well, I don't believe that's what the Bible teaches, but some people believe everything in this world is controlled by the Jews and everything like that. But, I think we're going to see tonight that what it fits best with is the United States of America. And if it does take place anytime soon, I believe it must be the U.S., okay? But if 200 years go by, who knows who's going to be in power at that point? Maybe it would be somebody else, okay? Now, I will say this, that regardless what the topic is in the Bible, sometimes you might hear something and have a different opinion, and that's fine. And look, I have no problem if you go home and talk to your wife or your husband and you discuss sermons and talk about things. But if you have a different opinion, you don't have the right to go to other church members and say, Brother Stuckey's wrong, it's referring to, Mecca, it's all about the Muslims, or it's referring to some city in India, it's all about, Hindus or whatever. It's just like, if you have a different opinion, that's fine, but obviously just keep that opinion to yourself and not spread a different doctrine at our church, okay? Revelation 17, verse 18, notice this. "And the woman which thou sawest is that great city, which reigneth over the kings of the earth," okay? Now, Revelation 17 is referring to primarily the Roman Catholic Church, but if you remember the first sermon in this mini-series, the concept of Babylon, one distinguishing factor about whatever is going to be the Babylon of its day is that it's ruling and reigning. that it is the #1 most powerful country that there is. Okay? It's not just a wicked empire or wicked country. North Korea is a wicked country. But don't tell me that they're the most powerful country in the world. They're not ruling and reigning over the kings of the earth, okay? And so when we talked about Babylon, we talked about Assyria and Egypt and, Persia and all those empires, there were other wicked countries during those time periods, but they weren't ruling and reigning, okay? And so a distinguishing factor about Babylon is that it must be the one ruling and reigning over the earth. Now let me say this, that throughout human history, there have been time periods where there was no country that was ruling and reigning over the kings of the earth. There have been times in history where there was not one country or kingdom that had this all-encompassing power. Many times throughout history, perhaps even most of history, there hasn't been one empire that has this dominant rule. But at times, an empire rises up which does have a dominant rule over all the kings of the earth, okay? Now look, if we're going to look at countries here today, the only country that could possibly fit with is the United States of America. Now you could say, well, I don't think the U.S. is powerful enough, and that's fine, you can have your opinion, but here's the thing, it would not make sense to say, well, I think it's, Norway. Right? It's like, look, Norway doesn't rule and reign over the kings of the earth. If there is a country that rules and reigns over the kings of the earth today and the leaders in the countries, that would be the United States of America. You say, why? The United States has military troops in over 150 countries around the world. I mean, in over half the countries in the world, the U.S. has military there. You say, why? Because they're making sure they control what's going on there. Okay? The U.S. is very, very powerful. Don't tell me that the Philippines has military in 150 countries around the world. But the United States does. The United States has military all over the world. And guess what? If somebody were to kill that military in that country, well, the U.S. is going to go to war with them. But people aren't going to do that. You know why? Because the U.S. is more powerful. That's the reality. They have military in over 150 countries around the world. So look, if this Babylon exists today, I think it fits pretty well with the United States of America. Go to Revelation 18. Revelation 18. Revelation 18. So reason number 1 is that the United States of America is the country, I believe, that's ruling and reigning today. They are the country that is extremely powerful in today's world. Okay? Revelation 18 verse 7, let's look at reason number 2. How much she hath glorified herself, and notice this, and lived deliciously. Lived deliciously. That's a statement there that's basically speaking to prosperity or financial wealth, okay? Lived deliciously. Financial wealth, okay? When it comes to the United States of America, the United States of America is a country that lives very deliciously. It's a very prosperous country. I mean, you could walk inside a Walmart or a grocery store and find things from all over the world. Everything's in the U.S. Any form of entertainment you want, the U.S. has everything. There is a list from Wikipedia. It's called the Credit Suisse 2019. This is a list of countries or geographic regions by total wealth, okay? And so in 2019, I'm not really sure how they determined this, but the worldwide wealth was $361 trillion throughout the entire world. Now, after COVID, it's about $5 trillion. It's gone down quite a bit, okay? But it was $361 trillion in 2019. However they determine it, I'm not an expert exactly on that, but $361 trillion. The United States had 106 trillion out of 361. So almost 30% of the world's wealth was in one country, the United States of America, okay? 106 trillion. Now look, there are a lot of countries in this world. There are hundreds of countries, okay? And the United States controls about 30% of the wealth based on this list. Outside of the U.S. at 106 trillion, the entire continent of Europe has 91 trillion. The entire continent of Europe has less financial wealth than all of the United States according to this list, okay? Now, that surprised me because there are a lot of countries in Europe that we think about being very prosperous. I mean, Germany, the United Kingdom. I believe Russia was considered in Europe for this. And all of Europe put together has less than the United States of America. So 106 trillion for the United States. Second on the list is China at 64 trillion. So it's 42 trillion less. Almost, less than, more than half, but like 60% of what the US has, which is actually higher than I expected. But number 3 on the list is Japan at 25 trillion. Less than 1/4 of the United States was number 3 on the list. Now here's the thing, when you add up the US and China and Japan together, assuming I'm doing my math right here, you got 195 trillion out of 361. That is over half of the world's wealth is in the US, China, and Japan. Okay, and 166 trillion left, depending on how they're rounding and things like that. So look, out of over half of the world's wealth is in the US, China, and Japan, and look, over half of that is in the United States of America, because the US has more than China and Japan put together. There's no question that the United States is a very financially prosperous country. No question about that, okay? Revelation 18, verse 7. Let's look at the third point here today. And so the third point is this, that the United States is a country with safety and security. The United States is a country with safety and security. Notice Revelation 18, verse 7. How much she hath glorified herself and lived deliciously, so much torment and sorrow give her. For she saith in her heart, I sit a queen and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. And so this empire that's being spoken of says, I sit a queen and am no widow and shall see no sorrow. Basically, it's an empire that's very powerful that says, I'm not going to have any sorrow. I'm not going to have any sadness. I don't have any worries. I don't have any fears. And you say, why? Because in the United States of America, you do not have to worry about some random bomb going off and killing thousands of people. Right now, look, it's a whole other topic. I'm not into conspiracies about 9/11, whatever. That's outside the scope of any sermon. But let me tell you something. In the Middle East and a lot of countries around the world, you can have bomb strikes that happen all the time. You can be attacked all of the time. Look, I didn't look into it. I guess I don't really care too much. But with Lebanon, tons of people are like, well, it was Israel. Because, look, over in that part of the world, those sorts of strikes happen all the time. In the United States of America, you don't have to worry about that. It's a country that is safe and secure from outside countries. And you say, why? Because a little ant doesn't usually attack a big spider. Right? It doesn't make sense to attack someone that's going to beat you up. Do you really think that you'd go down the street and just start a fight with like the world's greatest fighter? Would that make much sense? Probably not, because you're not going to win. Right? So look, it doesn't make sense that a country would go and start a war with the U.S. Whenever wars get started with the U.S., guess who's the one starting them? The U.S. is the one starting the wars. Why? Because they're more powerful, okay? It says, I sit a queen and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. The U.S. is a very safe and secure country that does not have to worry about outside threats from other countries, okay? Revelation 18, verse 22, let's look at point number 4. Revelation 18, verse 22, notice the music that is mentioned in Revelation 18, verse 22. And the voice of harpers and musicians and of pipers and trumpeters. And so it says harpers, musicians, pipers, and trumpeters. That's all referring to music that's being produced, okay? And the Bible's saying about this end times Babylon that this empire is producing music, and when this music is gone, people miss this music. It's music they're used to listening to. Let me ask you a question here in the Philippines. What country's music do you listen to outside of the Philippines? Do you listen to a lot of music from China? Do you hear that on the radio? When we're in Rizal Park, I remember hearing Celine Dion and Disney music. Music that came from the United States of America. You don't normally hear music from India and Japan and other countries. You usually hear it from the United States of America. Look, you can go around the world and guess what? People know who Katy Perry is. They know who Lady Gaga is. They know who Justin Bieber is. But they don't know who the most famous musician in a lot of these countries are. You say, why? Because people don't listen to music from other countries for the most part. For the most part, they listen to music that comes from the United States of America. Now, I don't understand why. Even from a worldly sense, I think the U.S. is garbage. Music is for the most part garbage. But people like Lady Gaga. People like Justin Bieber, Katy Perry, and whoever's come out in the last 10 years. You can let me know so I'll be more updated after the sermon or whatever. I don't really know, okay? But look, people listen to music that's American music. I remember when I visited here in 2014, my wife and I were on a bus ride somewhere, and I just remember being like, oh wow, I feel like I'm in the U.S. because you're hearing just American music on the radio. But do you ever hear music from other countries? Not very often. And look, it's like that around the world. It is not just like that here in the Philippines. It is like that around the world where people know American artists. They listen to American music, okay? Go to verse 23. Point number 5, the U.S. is filled with rich and powerful people. Rich and powerful people, okay? Revelation 18, verse 23, it says this, "And the light of a candle shall shine no more at all in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee." Notice this, "For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived." Now, when the Bible's saying great men of the earth, it's referring to powerful men, famous men, prestigious men. It's not saying, hey, this was like John the Baptist, okay? When it's saying great men of the earth, we're saying somebody who has a lot of power and finances and influence, somebody who has a lot of money. And the merchants that come from the U.S., according to the Bible, if this is referring to the U.S., the merchants coming from Babylon are very great men, very powerful men, okay? I have a list here of the top 6 retailers in the world, and 5 out of 6 of these are American companies. And I'll name them here in a second. I don't have the list for the most richest people in the world, but I remember looking at a list before of the richest people in the world, and like, you know, half of the top 10 or something like that, or more than half were from the United States of America. Okay? Number 1 on the list of top retailers in the world is Amazon. Okay? Number 2 is Walmart. Number 3 is Shopee. Just kidding. Not Shopee, okay? Number 2 is Walmart. Number 3 is Costco. Number 4 is the Schwartz Group. Do you know the Schwartz Group? Germany? Well, it's from Germany. I don't know. It's like the Schwartz Group. Am I mispronouncing? Svats. Okay, the Svats Group. Number 4, the Svats Group. Okay, something like that. From Germany. Number 5, Kroger. Number 6, Walgreens. Now, I don't know if you know all those companies, but, you know, I know all of them except, you know, the Schwartz Group, right? But 5 out of those are American companies, right? And when you go to these places, you go, I mean, Amazon has everything in the world from it, pretty much. Walmart, you walk in there, they have everything. I mean, and I grew up with it, so it just seems normal to me. But it's just like, it's not normal to other places around the world. But the United States has everything. They live very deliciously. But look, when you're looking at the merchants of the U.S., they are the great men of the earth. Okay? They have a lot of money. But I want you to notice something about this. Go to Revelation 18, verse 3. Revelation 18, verse 3. Revelation 18, verse 3. And notice this. Actually, go to Revelation 18, verse 11. Revelation 18, verse 11. I want you to notice this. The United States has very rich and powerful merchants, okay, rich and powerful people that produce lots of stuff, but it's not really a country that has tons of merchants. It's just the merchants they have are the ones that are very powerful. Notice what it says in Revelation 18, verse 11. "And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise anymore." And see, the Bible speaks about this end times Babylon. It's actually one that's actually buying from all of these other countries. And that's something that they talk about all the time in the U.S., how the U.S. is always buying from China, and they want to stop that. I remember when I was a kid, you kind of made the joke that every toy you had was made in Taiwan. It was Taiwan. Now it's like always made in China, okay? And so the United States tends to have merchants that are very rich and powerful, but they usually are getting their stuff from other countries where it's produced at a low price, okay? Now, turning your Bible to Jeremiah 50, actually. Jeremiah 50. Jeremiah 50. Jeremiah chapter 50. And so, when it comes to this end times Babylon, it mentions it in Revelation 17 and 18, but actually Jeremiah 50 and 51, which is where we're going to be for most of the rest of the sermon, it actually is mentioning Babylon, okay? Now, here's what you need to understand about prophecy in general and about Babylon mentioned in Jeremiah, is that oftentimes prophecy has dual applications. And so there are verses that are pertaining to the Babylon of that day, but also futuristic verses as well. And there are some verses in these chapters, and we don't have time to dissect this because we're already spending a lot of time in Revelation, okay, over all these weeks. But in Jeremiah 50 and 51, there are verses that could not even apply to the Babylon from thousands of years ago. They must apply to something that's more futuristic, and I believe it fits with the U.S., okay? But I want you to notice something in Jeremiah 50, verse 37. Proof number 7 that this end times Babylon is referring to the United States is the fact that the U.S. is a country filled with people from all over the world. Notice what it says in Jeremiah 50, verse 37. A sword is upon their horses and upon their chariots, and upon, notice this, all the mingled people that are in the midst of her. All the mingled people that are in the midst of her. The United States is a country that has people from all over the world living there. Tons of foreigners. A very mingled country. All the mingled people. What it's saying is people from all over the world. Countries from everywhere. You see, here in the Philippines, the vast majority of people that you find out in public are from the Philippines. They're Filipinos. I mean, there's a few Koreans, there's a few, people from Japan or China and other places, but the vast majority of people that live in the Philippines are from the Philippines, right? I mean, you go to Russia, what you're going to find is a very large percentage of Russians and then a few people from other areas as well. You go to India, the vast majority of people are from India, and then a few people from other countries as well. You go to the United States, you know what you find? People from everywhere. I mean, what's the country with the most overseas Filipino workers? The United States of America. But did you know that's the same story for countries all over the world? I mean, 10 million people from Mexico live in the United States of America. Tons of people from Russia and India and countries all over the world. There is an apartment complex very close to the Verity Baptist Church building. And it was always my favorite. I think it was called Northland Village Apartments. And it was my favorite apartment complex to knock. It had like 90 doors. But because when you knocked it, you'd find people from all over the world. There are literally like 25 different countries living in that apartment complex. It's right beside the church. It's like, just like a 5-10 minute walk down to the Verity Baptist Church. But you knock there, you have no clue who's going to open the door. I mean, you knock on the door, and then so often they'll say they don't speak English, and you always are curious, what country are you from? Because you don't know. I mean, you have absolutely no idea what country. I mean, I've met people there from Iran, from Iraq, from all over the place. Countries around the world. And it's especially like that in California, but realize that the United States of America is a country that is very ethnically diverse. There are people from all over the world that live in the United States of America. The same cannot be said for the vast majority of countries, okay, in this world today. But in the United States, there's people from all over the world. They're the mingled people. Go to Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51. I mean, here's the thing. When you're in a country such as the Philippines or pretty much any country in the world, if you're obviously from another country, I mean, people notice you when you're walking by. Sometimes they'll stop and look at you because they're like, I wonder why he's living here. Nobody wonders in the U.S. because there's people from everywhere. Okay? Here when I walk, some people are kind of curious. They stop and look at me, right? Brother Mateus, sometimes it happens. But look, in the United States, you wouldn't stand out at all. You say, why? Because there's people from everywhere in the United States of America. It's by far the country that has the most, foreigners living there. Jeremiah 51, verse 9. We would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her, and let us go everyone into his own country. Right? When it's referring to Babylon, it says, let every one of us go into his own country. Why would the Bible say that? Because there's a lot of people living in this end times Babylon that are not from that country. I have a list here with the countries with the most foreigners. Number 1 on the list is the United States of America with 48.2 million people that live there were born in other countries. 48.2 million, almost 50 million people. Number 2 on the list is Russia. And with Russia, I'm assuming it's the countries that are part of the Soviet Union that, now are living in, that's what I would presume. Number 2, Russia. Number 3, Saudi Arabia. So, hey, if you're a believer in Mecca, then, Mecca's in Saudi Arabia. It's number 3, right? Number 4, Germany. Number 5, the UK. Now here's the thing, the United States combined has 48.2 million. Those other 4 countries that are next combined have 41 million. And the United States, they have more than 48 million foreigners living there. The next 4 highest countries combined have only 41 million. I would have added another country, but it just barely gets above that 48.2 million, so I just kept number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. But look, there's no question when you're talking about a country that's filled full of people from all over, it's the United States of America. Okay? Go back to Jeremiah 50. Jeremiah 50. Jeremiah 50. Now, could this change if the world lasts 50 or 100 years or something like that? It could change, but I want you to realize that these verses, they're not even close to fulfilling other countries. I mean, when people have theories about Mecca or Jerusalem or Rome, they can find a few verses that will fit with that, and it's like, oh wow, yeah, I can see that. But then there's a lot of verses that just do not fit with those countries. There are a lot of proofs. I mean, we're not even halfway through the sermon yet. There are a lot of proofs for why the United States, and look, there's charts online of the United States being the end times Babylon that have like 75 proofs. And I looked through these, and a lot of them are kind of ones where I can see what they're saying. I'm just not sure if that's what the Bible's saying, because we're talking about prophecy, so it's kind of hard to know exactly. But there are so many different reasons in Jeremiah 50 and 51, so many things that fit with the United States of America. And I just kind of chose some of these. Jeremiah 50 verse 12, notice this. In Jeremiah 50 verse 12, it says this, "Your mother shall be sore confounded. Your mother shall be sore confounded. She that bare you shall be ashamed." And the Bible says here, your mother shall be sore confounded. And what the Bible's saying is that this end times Babylon has a mother. Think about that. Now, when you think about the United States of America, if you were to think of a mother country of the United States of America, what would you think of? England, right? England is the country that the United States, because here's the thing, before the going back 500 years ago, if you went to what's the United States of America today, you're going to find mostly Native Americans living there. It was a much different place, but the United States is a country that was really birthed by England. Now, if you look at countries from all over the world, it's not really like that. You can't really point to a mother country in many countries. I'm not even sure if any countries around the world. I wouldn't call Spain the mother country of the Philippines, because here's the thing, when Spain came in a long time ago, the vast majority of people still had the Philippine heritage. It's not like everybody just started speaking Spanish and everything changed, okay? The Native Americans didn't speak English, but the country completely changed when it was basically birthed by England. I understand there are people that visited before that, but when you're thinking of a mother country, that fits with the United States of America. It doesn't really fit with other countries. Now, notice what it says also in Jeremiah 50 verse 12. This kind of ties together with the last point. "Your mother shall be sore confounded. She that bare you shall be ashamed. Behold, the hindermost of the nations shall be a wilderness, a dry land, and a desert." The hindermost of the nations. What that's saying is this end times Babylon is going to be a newer country. It's not going to be a country that basically has been around for thousands of years, because it's the hindermost of the nations, which means countries were birthed long before this end times Babylon. And when you look at the United States of America, look, when it comes to the Native Americans, that there's still a small remnant in the U.S., but it's very small. It's a completely different country. When you look at a country like Russia, there's been changes that have taken place, boundary lines have changed, but look, Russia hasn't really changed much in a long time. It's the same group of people, the same kind of ethnicity that was there before. The United States, completely different. It's 100% changed. In the Philippines, Spain came here, and eventually, everything that took place and everything. But look, the majority of people here, they still had Filipino ethnicity. Now, we understand that every country to some degree is, intermingled and stuff like that. But you can't really look at a country that has completely changed like the United States of America. They are a very new country. Now, we understand sometimes people will declare, well, we just declared Israel country or something like that. But when we're looking at a country that has a mother country and is really just a completely different country than before, what you're looking at is the United States of America. Okay? Go to Jeremiah 50 verse 23. Jeremiah 50 verse 23. Jeremiah 50 verse 23. Look, I mean, countries all the time, they'll declare independence and things like that, but it's not a totally new country, though. It's not a country that you can look to and say, well, we've got a mother country, we're the hindermost of the nations. Proof number 10 is this, that the United States of America are the policemen of the world. The United States of America are the policemen of the world. Notice what it says in Jeremiah 50, verse 23. How is the hammer of the whole earth cut asunder and broken? How has Babylon become a desolation among the nations? The Bible says here, how is the hammer of the whole earth cut asunder and broken? And so the Bible's describing this end times Babylon as a country that you'd say, you know what, they're the ones that are basically, they're the hammer. They're the ones that are in charge. They're basically the police. And that kind of fits into earlier where we said they have military bases in 150 countries around the world. Well, as it goes in America, so goes the world. If a big war is going to take place, the United States has a decision. They basically have a part in that decision. Okay, if the United States says we don't want this to take place, then you know what? Countries probably aren't going to go to war. They don't want the U.S. getting involved in it. Countries around the world, wars that happen around the world, the United States is involved in like half of them. When a big thing takes place, the United States is the world's police that determines, well, we say you should do this, and they'll go in there and step in there. And look, it's all around the world like this. I remember seeing a documentary in Africa, because you don't normally hear about a lot of wars going on in Africa. And there was this big battle, because they made like a Hollywood movie about it, Hotel Rwanda. And, you know, we saw it in a college class like, you know, a decade ago or whatever. And I think it won Best Picture or was nominated. Hotel Rwanda. Rwanda's a country in Africa. And basically you had the Hutus and the Tutsis, and you had this big battle take place and everything. Then all of a sudden, you know, the United Nations step in, which was led by the United States. And then, you know, the leader of that country now was good friends with Bill Clinton and everything like that. It's like the United States is really the ones that make the determination of what goes around the world. They are the policemen of the world. They are the hammer of the whole earth, okay? Go to Jeremiah 50, look at verse 37. Jeremiah 50, verse 37. Jeremiah 50, verse 37. Now, I believe that in Jeremiah 50, verse 37, this is a bit of a dual application. And obviously when we're dealing with prophecy, we know in part, we prophesy in part. But I want you to notice verse 37, Jeremiah 50, verse 37. A sword is upon their horses and upon their chariots and upon all the mingled people that are in the midst of her. And they shall become as women. It says they shall become as women. Now the context here is that when the battle takes place, they're going to become as women. But I believe this could also be a reference to basically this end times Babylon being a very effeminate country. When the Bible's referring to something men becoming as women, it's basically referring to them being very girly, not standing up to fight. Go to Jeremiah 51, verse 30. Jeremiah 51, verse 30. Jeremiah 51, verse 30. And in Jeremiah 51, verse 30, it says, the mighty men of Babylon have forborne to fight. They remained in their holds. Their might have failed. They became as women. Okay? Now, when it comes to the United States of America, and it comes to the countries that are the most pro-LGBT, like half of the top 10 are in the United States of America. San Francisco, their LGBT percentage, and here's the thing, these are very hard statistics to come by, because whether or not people identify themselves as homos or whatever, it's not necessarily directly accurate, but 15.4% of people in San Francisco are sodomites, okay? Now, here's the thing. Here in the Philippines, we have a lot of sodomites. And so these percentages might not seem crazy to you. In other countries I've been to Guyana, where I didn't really see anybody that was an open sodomite. You know, I'm sure that there were some, but it's not like you saw lots of them. Here you do see a lot of them, okay? But in San Francisco, 15.4%. I remember my wife and I went to San Francisco. I've only been a couple times. And the reason why I stopped going were because of just the LGBT. And I remember we went to San Francisco, and you know, one time my friend and I, we got onto this ferry boat, because you know, you take boats to ride across the river from, you know, one city to the next. It saves on traffic time and stuff like that. And we were just having a normal conversation about the Bible, okay? And it was right after the Golden State Warriors had won their first NBA title in a while. And all of a sudden there's like these 20 drunk sodomites that got on the ferry. I mean, and it wasn't hard to tell that, most of them were sodomites. The way they were dressed, and they were drunk and everything like that. And my friend and I, we're just having a Bible conversation. And then he told me, he's like, hey, all of them are looking at us like they're really angry right now. Now, I don't know what we said. I guess maybe just talking about the Bible, but it's like, you got to be careful around sodomites. You got to be careful around drunk people. A drunk sodomite, it's like, all right, let's go down to the lower level where there's nobody and just, whatever. So that's one of my stories in San Francisco. Another one, when we were there were guys, making out. And we saw that just in San Francisco. And in the U.S., that's not really common in most places, okay? And I remember another time we just went down to this beach, and then there was just like a group of like 5 or 6 people that walked by us, and like half of them were sodomites. There are a lot of sodomites in San Francisco, but not just San Francisco. They have the reputation, but Seattle is 12.9%, and in Seattle, there's streets that they've painted rainbow colors. In Seattle, I mean, a lot of the sports teams, a lot of the American sports teams now have rainbow colors on their jerseys. And I know this is happening around the world now. It's like, I mean, it's happening everywhere now. Like the Denver Nuggets, they have like the rainbow colors now, and it's happening in some soccer teams around the world as well. But in the U.S., I mean, the streets of Seattle, they're not paved in gold. They're paved in rainbow colors, of course missing the 7th color, just having 6 colors. Atlanta, 12.8%. Minneapolis, 12.5%. 1 out of 8 people. Boston, 12.3%. It says Sacramento, 9.8%. I don't see that in Sacramento. I mean, I live there, and I didn't really think we had that many sodomites, to be honest. So, I don't know. Maybe they're attributing others in California from San Francisco down to Sacramento. Portland, 8.8%. Portland is far above Sacramento. I don't know where they got those statistics. Because Portland, there are so many homos in Portland, it's ridiculous. Okay, that's really close to Sure Foundation Baptist Church. It's like 20 minutes away. Different state, but only 20 minutes away. But what I'm telling you is this, that in the United States of America, it has become a very effeminate country. And has become filled with sodomites, okay? Jeremiah 51, notice what it says in verse 53. Jeremiah 51, verse 53. And look, like I said, when it comes to these verses on prophecy, people can have different opinions about these verses, how you interpret them. We see through a glass darkly, okay? This is not an exact science, but I believe many of these things really fit with the United States. But proof number 12 is this, the missile strength of the United States of America. Notice what it says in Jeremiah 51, verse 53. Though Babylon should mount up to heaven. Even if Babylon mounts up to heaven, and though she should fortify the height of her strength. So fortify the height of her strength. If she mounts up to heaven and fortifies the height of her strength, basically she's strong in the air, okay? Now look, the Babylon that existed thousands of years ago, they didn't fortify the height of their strength. They didn't have this big military power in the air, okay? Yet from me shall spoilers come unto her, saith the Lord. So even if Babylon mounts up to heaven and fortifies the height of her strength. Now, this fits with the missile defense system that the United States of America has, okay? Look, if a country launches a missile at the United States, the U.S. will just shoot it down before it hits them. They have the technology and the power, okay? That's what's so amazing about how the U.S. is going to be destroyed, because honestly, it's not logical that the U.S. could be destroyed at this point unless you had a lot of countries teaming up, all shooting missiles, and then the computer technology or whatever probably will just malfunction. I'm not really sure. Obviously, that's a long time from now, or a lot of crazy things will happen before then. But look, if a country tries to bomb the U.S. will just strike it down. That's one reason why, just logically, with 9/11, why a lot of people think it's a conspiracy, because like, how would they even have the power to do that to the U.S.? Because the U.S. has the strongest defense system in the world. If you shoot a missile at them, they're just going to strike it down, okay? Look, other countries around the world, they don't have that strength. And let me tell you something, Babylon back then, they did not have the power to shoot down every arrow that comes at them. You shoot a flaming arrow at them with fire, it's going to hit them. Right? But the United States of America, they have fortified the height of their strength, okay? They have a powerful missile defense system. They have power in the air, okay? Proof number 13. Proof 13. And I believe, and this is my opinion, that there's going to be a strong connection between the end times Babylon and Israel, okay? You say, why is that? Well, all of these events in the Bible during the end times, it's starting in Jerusalem. Okay, the abomination of desolation. It spreads to the rest of the world, but it's starting in that location. Now, the Antichrist is going to come from that seventh empire, but I want you to realize that seventh empire is going to kind of help the Antichrist take power. Okay? So since this is happening over in Jerusalem, I believe it makes sense there will be a connection between the end times Babylon and between Israel, that part of the world. Ask yourself this question. Is there a connection between the United States and Israel? Absolutely. There is no question about that. The United States is the most pro-Israel country in the world. I mean, Baptist preachers in the U.S. are like the most pro-Israel. I mean, they preach all the time. John Hagee is very famous for his sermons just praising Israel. Donate money to Israel. Help them build that temple. You know, it's mind-boggling. It's like you're helping the Antichrist take power. But look, in the United States, they are very pro-Israel. This is a switch from the last 100 years. I mean, the U.S. has become an extremely pro-Israel country, more than any country in the world. But you know, what's also interesting about this is that in the world, there are not really a lot of Jews. It's not like Buddhism. There are not hundreds of millions of Jews in this world. There are less than 20 million. Okay, it's like 15 million, depending on what thing you look at. Well, there are 6.7 million Jews that live in Israel. There are 6.5 million that live in the United States of America. Now here, you never really run into Jews out soul winning, do you? I've run into plenty of Jews out soul winning in the U.S. You say, why? There's 6.5 million. I mean, 1 out of 50 people, like 2% of the population in the United States, and it's not a big religion worldwide. 6.5 million live in the U.S. You say, why? Well, I mean, Israel does have a lot of power. They have a lot of money as well, and their rich people usually tend to live in the U.S., the ones that are very rich and powerful, okay? And so 6.5 million, look, about 90% of the Jews in the world live in either Israel or the U.S. There is no country that has a connection to Israel like the United States of America. Now, you might ask this question, Brother Stuckey, you know, you've preached all of this against the U.S. Do you hate the U.S.? You know, I don't hate the U.S. I think the U.S. is a very good country. And, you know, the reason why I think it's a very good country, the biggest reason, is because you can serve God if you live in the United States in today's world. You know, do you realize that if you lived in Egypt, when Egypt was powerful, you weren't able to serve God? Say, how do you know that? Well, they left Egypt because of that reason. They were persecuted, and the big problem was the fact that they could not serve God in Egypt. Okay? You look at the persecution that Rome did to Christians. You look at a lot of these empires. Assyria, there's no way you would have been able to serve God over there. And so look, in a lot of these Babylons that have existed, you were not able to serve God. Now, it could come to that point in the U.S., and I do believe it will stretch to that direction. But in today's world, you can freely serve God in the U.S. You can freely go soul winning. Right? I mean, there's nothing preventing you from going door-to-door soul winning. And look, there have been wicked people that have tried to prevent it, but look, the laws have stated you're allowed to go. Even if they put a no soliciting sign on their door, you are still allowed to knock that door by law. Okay? You have the legal right. So look, you can freely serve God in the United States. I'm not saying it's a terrible country. I mean, there's a lot of great churches there, great soul winning going on, but I don't think that we should be blind about this. Okay? Obviously, I lived in the U.S. for most of my life. And look, you know, I do believe, and I believe for a long time, it is end times Babylon. Okay? So it's like, just because you're able to freely serve God, you know, you shouldn't take a blind eye and just say, well, this can't be the U.S. because this is a great country. Because that's one thing people say. It's just so godly and everything the U.S. does is perfect. Well, look, I don't believe that's reality. Okay? Go to Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51. So look, I don't hate the U.S. I mean, I think the U.S. is a great country. I mean, if it weren't for this whole COVID thing, I'm sure my wife and I, we would have visited the U.S. this year. I'm sure we will next year. So look, I don't hate the U.S., but I do believe it's end times Babylon. I don't see how all of these things fit with any other country. It's like you might be able to come up with a verse or two and say, well, look, it's Norway. Here's this verse. It's like, well, show me like 15 proofs, okay, that it's Norway. It's like, yeah, it's a rich country by capita. I understand that. People are very wealthy in Norway. Okay, it's not end times Babylon, okay? But I want you to notice something in Jeremiah 51, verse 7. It says this in Jeremiah 51, verse 7. Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. The Bible says here, Babylon hath been a golden cup. Now there's a transition in this verse, but I believe what this is indicating is that at one time this Babylon was actually used greatly by God. Hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand. But eventually they turned and they made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine. Therefore the nations are mad. Ask yourself this question about the United States. Has the United States always just been a wicked country that has done nothing for God? Not at all. If you look at the country in the world today that sends out the most missionaries, it's the United States of America. If you're going to look at a country that has the best churches, it's the United States of America. And if you're a soul winner and you will not find this sort of church in a lot of countries around the world. But, you'll find this kind of church all over in the U.S. Even outside of what we call the new IFB. Look, I went to good churches in the U.S. before I went to Verity Baptist Church. But look, you don't move from Europe to another country if you have a great church, right? There are not churches like this. I remember going before, there's this website, militarygetsaved.org, which lists all of the independent fundamental Baptist churches, and they're not very strict on that website. They list pretty much anything that claims to be IFB, even if they're very gray area on the King James issue. And it is both pro-repentance of sins and non-repentance of sins. So it's a mix of everything. It's a good generic site that gives you kind of information. And if you go to just a random state in the U.S., West Virginia, you'll find 15, 20, 25 churches. West Virginia, where I live most of my life, only has a few million people in it. Go to Spain, last I checked, with 60 million people, 0 churches. None. I think in all of Europe, there's a small handful. It's you go all around the world, you can't find any churches. There is no country that has the churches or is sending out the missionaries or supporting the missionaries like the United States of America. But to whom much is given, much is also required as well. If you have the best churches, then God's going to expect it to be a godly country. If you're hearing this kind of preaching and you're still living in fornication and adultery and drunkenness, and the country is getting more and more wicked, God will hold that country accountable. And I believe that fits with the United States of America, that will be held accountable even though they have done many great things for God. Now let me go through some of the objections to the United States of America here real quickly. 5 different objections. And look, you could go through a lot of objections that people have, because a lot of people say, how could this be the United States? But one objection is this, one of the big ones, that the Babylon is a religious system, they say. And they say the United States is not very religious. Now, I would say this, the United States is not a very religious country. Even though they have a lot of great churches, very few people go to church in the U.S. Very few. It is not a religious country. Door-to-door soul winning, look, most people aren't interested. Most people aren't religious. Most people haven't read the Bible. Now you go to some other countries, you go to Saudi Arabia, where Mecca is. Now Saudi Arabia is a very religious country. Obviously not under the Christian realm, but Islam, but they are a very religious country. India is a very religious country. Obviously very ungodly. But I don't agree that this end times Babylon has to be a very big religious system, because I don't believe all of the Babylons that existed before were super religious. Now obviously Rome has the Roman Catholic Church, we understand that and everything like that. I don't see any indication that Assyria was super religious. So look, I don't believe that this end times Babylon, and the reason why people think that is because in Revelation 17 they think Roman Catholic Church, and that is what it's referring to. Okay? But that's not Revelation 18. And just because the Roman Catholic Church is chapter 17 doesn't mean you have to have some religious system coming out of chapter 18. That's why people think Mecca or some other false religion. I've heard people say Revelation 18 is referring to the Mormon church. Okay, you hear everything with Revelation 18, and yes, the Mormons are very rich, but you're not going to tie together all these things. So one thing is this. They say, well, Babylon has to be a religious system. I don't agree with that, okay? I don't think that's biblical. Another thing they say is this, that verses in Revelation chapter 17 do not fit with the United States of America, okay? Well, I don't disagree with that either, because I don't believe Revelation 17 is about the United States of America. I believe it's speaking to what was the Babylon of John's day, and then it transitions in Revelation 18 to the end times Babylon. Okay, so I don't disagree with that. There are some verses that, yeah, they fit a lot better with Rome than the United States. That doesn't mean that the Rome in chapter 17 has to be the one in chapter 18, because chapter 17 is the present tense, and then it looks towards the future. So it's going to be a different one in Revelation 18. Okay, now some things fit with all of these empires. Like they have to be a world power. Yeah, that fits with Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, and all of them. But directly, Revelation 18 is referring to the end times Babylon. Revelation 17 to the Roman Empire. Another objection they have is this, that the United States is not a wicked country, okay? Now look, I don't agree with that, because there is more bloodshed in the U.S. than any country in the world, by far. All of the wars have been started pretty much by the U.S. And here's the thing, when people say this, they think it's okay that the U.S. goes to war with all of these countries, like it's no big deal. Well, why would it be justified to start wars with other countries? And you know what, they always say that they're trying to free these countries and everything like that. It's like, look, you know, oftentimes they're trying to get the oil out of the ground, or they're trying to get more power or whatever. But it's like the U.S. is a wicked country. And look, abortions are through the roof in the U.S. I mean, there are like, what, I think 1 million babies are aborted a year in the U.S. 1 million babies are aborted. That's a lot of babies. 1 million. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of abortions here. There are not a million babies aborted here, though, per year. Now, here's the thing. The Philippines is about 1/3 the size population of the United States. I don't believe there's 333,000 abortions per year here. Okay? In the U.S., there's over 1 million. And look, the U.S. is getting more and more wicked. If you pay any attention to politics in the U.S., they're getting worse and worse and worse and more wicked. So look, at one time, I wouldn't say the U.S. was a wicked country, but look, at one time, I believe the U.S. was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, and there's a transition that's being talked about, okay? So look, I would disagree when they say the U.S. is not a wicked country. I believe it is a very wicked country now. Another objection people have is this. Go to Revelation 18. Revelation 18. Another objection they have is this, that in the list in Revelation 18, verses 11 through 13, there are things mentioned that are sold, and these are not things that would fit with present day the United States of America. Okay? Revelation 18, verse 11. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise anymore. So this Babylon's going to buy from countries around the world the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones, and of pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet, and all Thyan wood, and all manner vessels of ivory, and all manner vessels of most precious wood, and of brass and iron and marble, and cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense and wine and oil and fine flour and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and souls of men. Now let me say this, that when you look at this list, I think the main point God's trying to drive home is everything. Because doesn't it mention pretty much everything? One of the big objections they have on this list is when it says chariots. Because they say, well, you know, the United States, when do they ever buy chariots? Well, I think it's just referring to cars. Right? Because he's trying to address it to John so he understands. And look, a chariot, he's probably referring to a car or vehicles. And there's no question that the U.S. buys a lot of vehicles from other countries around the world. I don't see that as a Bible error because, you know, the Bible also mentions with end times prophecy, it mentions arrows. Do you really believe that during the end times, a bow and arrow is going to be the weapon that's being used? Probably an arrow is a missile. Because it's trying to write it in a way so John could understand it, and obviously, you know, in John's day, they don't have a lot of these modern things, okay? So I believe when it says chariots, it's just referring to cars. Some of the other things on this list I've heard debated. I don't know if they refer to other things. I'm not an expert on clothing. That people said vessels of ivory doesn't make sense. You know, I know nothing about ivory except 446 in our hymnals, the Ivory Palaces is the name of the song. That's all I know about ivory, okay? But look, I believe there's just, if there's things that no longer fit, I believe it's giving you something that basically would be understandable. And I look at this as categories, basically categories of everything, and it's saying everything is bought. Because it says even at the end, slaves and souls of men. It's listing everything, okay? Go to Revelation 18, verse 17. Revelation 18, verse 17. And the last objection, and the big objection is this, that Babylon is a city and the United States is a country, okay? Now, when we're looking at various empires that have existed, many of them have like a dominant country or a dominant city for that country. For example, with Assyria. Look, a lot of people, probably don't even know who Assyria is, but they know who Nineveh is. And they think of the empire of Nineveh. Well, that's the capital city of Assyria, okay? In fact, Babylon is not actually the name of the empire. Now, I always say the Babylonian Empire because that's how we know it, but it's the Chaldean Empire. Babylon was the chief city, okay? And so oftentimes these empires will have one dominant city, okay? And people say with the United States of America, well, it's saying Babylon, which is a city, and you're saying a country. Now, I would say this, that I don't believe that this Babylon has to be one specific place. I think it can be all over. But I do believe in Revelation 18, we actually can see, if this is referring to the U.S., what city it's actually referring to, okay? And it makes sense with what the most powerful city in the U.S. is. Notice what it says in Revelation 18, verse 17. For in 1 hour so great riches has come to naught, and every shipmaster, notice this, every shipmaster and all the company in ships and sailors, and as many as trade by sea, stood afar off, and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what city is like unto this great city? And they cast dust on their heads and cried, weeping and wailing, saying, alas, alas, that great city. Notice, wherein were made rich all that had ships in the sea by reason of her costliness. For in 1 hour is she made desolate. Notice how it's emphasizing the water and the ships and the seas. And so when we're looking at what this is referring to, if this is the United States of America, I do believe it is referring to a city here, okay? Now, we say the United States of America because, just like you could say like, Egypt or Assyria, okay? But what city would it be referring to? Well, it would have to be a city that's a port city, okay? And what's the most powerful city in the United States? New York City. Guess what? It's a port city. It fits with Revelation 18, 17 through 19. There's a reason why he's emphasizing the water and the ships and everything like that. And so look, it would fit with, you're not going to look at a city that's very like Chicago, Illinois, which is in the middle of the U.S. You're going to look at a country that's basically going to be where they have tons of ships going in and out, because that's what it mentions. That would fit with New York City. And look, there is no question New York City is the chief city of the United States. There are other big cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, but if you're looking at one chief city, at least in today's world, the chief city is not Washington, D.C. The chief city is New York City. What's interesting about this is New York City is also about the most diverse place in the entire world. There are people from all over the world, tons of different religions in New York City. So look, a lot of the verses we looked at, that could most specifically be referring to New York City specifically. They are an extremely diverse place. And look, this even fits with what I talked about earlier about how I believe we'll have a connection to Israel. There is no city in the U.S. that has a closer connection to Israel than New York City. You say, why? 1 out of 8 people in New York City are Jewish. 1 out of 8 people. Now, let me ask you a question. How often do you run into Jews here in the Philippines? 1 out of 8 people in New York City, actually more than 1 out of 8. Based on the latest chart I saw, 13%. Outside of Israel, that is the chief place where there are a lot of Jews. Jehovah's Witnesses and Jews just reside in New York City. I don't know what the connection is there. I'm still trying to figure that out. But Jehovah's Witnesses and Jews. But look, New York City is filled with people from all over the world. So look, I believe verses 17 through 19, if you want to say New York City, I wouldn't be against that either, because that is the chief city. And I believe a lot of these verses probably are specifically referring to that great city, New York City. Okay? Now go to Revelation 17. Revelation 17. Revelation 17. Now on Sunday, we're going to have a test on all this material. So you better memorize every verse, every proof and everything like that. Just kidding. I know this is a lot of information to take in, but look, we're going through Revelation. Right? We had to know from day one we're going through Revelation. We're going to go deep into the Bible. And you know what? We preach a lot of practical sermons on Sundays, but sometimes you got to just dig into the Bible. And look, this makes the Bible really interesting. Jeremiah 50 and 51. It's like, man, a lot of the stuff, even in the Old Testament, we could be studying the Bible for the rest of our lives and not even scratch the surface. And many of these things that I'm preaching here tonight, are things that I've already heard in sermons. Like I wrote down, I learned, and everything like that, and I reviewed and stuff like that, and some other things I saw or I looked at and I thought, applied and stuff like that. But it's like a lot of what you learn, you hear from sermons, and then you just retain the information you learn. That's why it's so good to take notes and retain that information. And then you know what? You can slowly add on to it as you hear more and more preaching. Sometimes you got to dig deep into the Bible. But I want you to see Revelation 17 as we close this out. Revelation 17 verse 10. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is. Now the one that is referring to Rome. We talked about that last week. That's the 6th empire. That's the empire that was during that day. And the other is not yet come. I believe that's the United States of America or New York City. And then notice this, and when he cometh, notice, he must continue a short space. He must continue a short space. Okay? Now I believe when he says he must continue a short space, obviously we see through a glass darkly. This is my interpretation. I believe that's saying that when this empire takes control, it's not going to last for 1,000 years. I believe a short space is referring to a limited time period. Now, Rome was an empire that lasted for a very long time. Okay? They were in power for a super long time. I'm not really sure how long Egypt was in power for, but Rome was in power for a really long time. I mean, at the time of Christ, before that, till like even 1,000 years after, okay? The United States, or whoever this end times Babylon is, they will not last for 1,000 years. It will continue for a short space. Now, one thing we need to understand is this: the determination of when this end times Babylon has power, that's kind of in God's eyes and in God's hands. Right? Like I personally would look at just after World War I, roughly 100 years ago, where basically the U.S. became the most powerful country in the world. But even if they were the most powerful country in the world, because that's when they had a ton of military after that, would the Bible describe that as being a country that ruled over the kings of the earth? Probably not, actually. Even if they became the most powerful country, that doesn't mean that they were ruling over the kings of the earth. When did they reach the point where God would say they were ruling over the kings of the earth and they became wicked? Look, we see through a glass darkly. Right? I would say that if this is the U.S. is end times Babylon, I believe we're already in that time period. Not that we're in the end times, but during the time where they have that power. But maybe in God's eyes, he wouldn't look at it that way. I'm not really sure. Okay? Pretty much from 100 years ago is when the U.S. was considered to be the strongest country. We're actually just talking about this before the service. But the Cold War took place, and it was like U.S. versus Russia, U.S. versus Soviet Union was like that big battle that was going on for a while and stuff like that. And some people disputed it. So, maybe you'd look at less than 50 years. I don't know. In today's world, there is no country that's as powerful as the U.S., but when did that really start in God's eyes? I'm not really sure. One thing I would say also that I believe really fits with the U.S., and one thing that's also interesting, I should have mentioned earlier in the sermon, when you look at countries around the world, people in Germany speak German. People in France speak French. People in Italy speak Italian. Right? People in, the Philippines speak Filipino. Right? I mean, obviously, I'm not getting into a Filipino-Tagalog argument, but look, people from around the world, people, they speak generally the language, it's named after whatever that country is. People in the United States of America speak American? No, because the U.S. has a mother country. Right? People speak English. The vast majority of countries say, what is the language of the country? What is their language? It's usually named after the country. Okay? But the U.S., they don't speak American. Okay? They speak English. Okay? But I do believe it makes a lot of sense that whatever is the end times Babylon, unless a long time goes by, I believe it will be an English-speaking country. Even if it's not the U.S., even if another country emerges, I have trouble imagining it not being an English-speaking country unless a lot of time goes by. I have trouble imagining the world speaking Chinese, just like everybody speaks Chinese. But look, English is the language that's taking over the world. There is no question English is taking over the world. I mean, in many countries around the world, here in the Philippines, you drive and you see all kinds of signs that are written in English. And the younger generations, they all know English. You say, why? Because they're listening to the music, they're watching the movies of America, they're watching the TV shows from America, and they're learning English at a young age. And look, they're teaching in schools in English oftentimes in many countries around the world. Look, I have trouble imagining some other language coming in and taking power because English is really becoming a more and more dominant country. Could that change if 200 years go by and we'll all be speaking Mandarin Chinese? Yeah, it's possible. I guess anything is possible. I'm not sure all those verses would fit with Mandarin. I mean, I think what would be more likely is there'd be some undiscovered island where nobody lives there, and they end up becoming a superpower in a couple hundred years. And look, that's possible. That's pretty much what happened with the U.S., where basically it just became, it had a mother country and everything changed. And, we'll see. Obviously, with prophecy, we see in part. Let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing us to be here today and just getting to see kind of these deep things in the Bible and try to make applications and everything. And, I ask you to help all of us when we read the Bible to try to pay attention the best we can and study things out like this. And that everyone in this room would realize that I'm not claiming that every proof I had is for sure I'm exactly right. I mean, this is prophecy. I could be wrong, and we see through a glass darkly, God. But help us to understand the end times and study all of the Bible, God. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.